Hi there. If you're watching this video, you're probably one of two people. Either you know the series very well, can recite almost every page word for word and shot for shot, and are currently wondering who the hell I think I am to even talk about it. Or you have no idea what the series is and you're about 10 seconds away from switching videos or falling asleep. If you're the latter, worry not. I'll get to explaining right now. Basically, Claymore is an old manga series created by Nora Hiroyagi in 2001, with clear inspirations from more adult-oriented fantasy manga such as Berserk. It ran for 27 volumes all the way up to 2014, ending on its own terms with no real spin-offs or sequels. It did have an anime adaptation in 2007, which is how I was first introduced to it, but its ending deviated considerably from the arc in the manga and went no further after its first season. To summarise, the Claymores, as they're often called, are warriors tasked with the slaying of monsters named Yoma, using the powers they obtain from being human-Yoma hybrids. They work for a sinister, shadowy organisation called, well, the organisation, that very definitely isn't an evil organisation. Much slaying, slashing, death and tragedy ensues, especially as more and more of the mysteries surrounding the Claymores and the organisation as a whole are uncovered. So, why do I care, and why should you care? Well, I'm not the kind of fan that will tell you this series is a flawless masterpiece, unjustly overlooked by the plebeian masses. It has its flaws, definitely, from the often awkward pacing, dialogue and story points that don't really add up, but there's enough here to like that I do offer a hesitant recommendation to people. It has a lot of unexpected charm to it, from its characters to its interesting world building, beautiful scenery, disgusting monster designs, and the intensity of its action sequences even within the confines of manga panels. When I first started getting into this series, I wasn't quite sure it would live up to similar stories at the time, but I found myself being surprised by how much I liked what I was watching, and eventually what I was reading. That should be no surprise considering the name of my YouTube channel, but I've avoided talking about this for so long because I couldn't think of a special enough occasion to justify it. What, though, could be more special than the 10th anniversary of my YouTube channel? Wooooo. Another noteworthy occasion is that it's been nearly a full decade since the manga series ended, so it allows me to look back on the story to assess how well it's aged over the past 10 years. For this video, I've organised my thoughts on the series into the good, the bad, and the ugly. The first two are obvious, but I've reserved the last one for talking about things that were fine when the series came out, but have since aged poorly. I'll save most of my discussion of the anime for that part. Let's get right to it. The good! First things first, the good of Claymore for me is the same as any other story I would say is good. The characters. Without good characters, it's difficult to care about anything that actually happens in a story. If I'm not interested in the characters, then I won't care about their journey, and fortunately Claymore does have central characters that I consider to be good, interesting characters. The obvious starting point is Claire, the protagonist, as protagonists are usually the ones who personify or represent the main themes of the story. At first, it's quite easy to dismiss Claire as a character. She's the stoic, stone-faced, badass warrior woman who cleaves through monsters without a care. The only hint to anything more at the start is her choice to help Rocky, a little kid whose job for the first half of the story is to be really annoying, and have him accompany her on her missions, suggesting a softer side to Miss Smiles and Happiness. The good news is that ultimately this is all a front, and the stone-faced, emotionless warrior that Claire presents masks a figure who's far more emotionally torn, callous with her own life, and often quite childish when pushed. The main reason she even takes Rocky with her is because he reminds her so much of her old self, but in a way she's a little different from him even as an adult. So what themes does Claire actually personify? It's difficult to say much about this without spoiling parts of the story, so consider this your warning that there will be some spoilers ahead. I'll try to keep major ones to a minimum. The main theme, I would say, encompasses all the warriors of the story is the discovery of meaning in their lives. Or to put it another way, they find reasons to appreciate life when so many of the warriors care little for their own. Claire is no different, as she is more than happy to throw her life away to save others, and her primary motivation throughout the story is to get revenge on one particular monster named Priscilla, a former warrior-turned-monster. More on that stuff later. This only starts to change when she encounters more people and forms more friendships in her life, to the point where later in the story she even starts to fear losing her life again. In contrast to so many other stories and arcs in this series, Claire's progression from death and vengeance seeker to an actually mature woman who finds value in life again is really well paced, While other parts of Claymore may seem either rushed or painfully slow, Claire's character arc is one that feels genuine and earned. Of course, you can't really talk about Claire without talking about Teresa, because she's the main reason Claire ends up the way she is. Teresa's story is basically Claire's backstory, but it's the moment when I realised the series was going to be worth sticking with over the other Shonen series. Teresa also goes through the arc of finding meaning in life again, but on a much more condensed level and in a way which sends ripples throughout the world of Claymore and its warriors. You see, Teresa isn't just a regular warrior. In her time, she was, and basically remains, the best warrior the organization has ever produced. She definitely knows it, and for most of her life she just does her job without a care in the world, and even less of a care for the humans she's meant to serve. When she meets Claire, who at this point is a young girl, she has no interest in having anything to do with her, since caring for her is not her duty, and she knows that Claire is doomed to be a warrior like her if she stays by her side. Obviously this happens anyway, but two important things happen in Teresa's story that are worth noting. Firstly, her choice to disobey the rules of the organization and go rogue are motivated by her love of Claire and hatred of the humans who disregard the value of life. It's one of the first choices she makes for herself rather than merely following orders. Secondly, Teresa dies not because of a lack of skill, but because she learns to empathize even with her enemies, against even her own better judgment. Such a progression may seem rushed, but it's handled very well, and importantly, her decisions have an impact long after her death. This is most apparent in the Ophelia arc, where Claire actually meets with one of the warriors from Teresa's generation, where pretty much all of what I've said is spelled out for Claire. My channel's name of Claymore Jesus was meant as a bit of a joke about this character, but in a way there's some truth to it. The only difference is that Teresa is not a flawless character. Unless we're talking about their power level, which is a whole other rant. So, after her development, it feels like she's earned her important status as a figure who sends ripples out to future generations of warriors. Speaking of rebel warriors, there's also Miria, the deuteragonist of the story. Wait, what did you just say? The hell's a deuteragonist? Basically, they're the second protagonist of the story, or to put it another way, if Claire is Frodo, then Miria is Aragorn. She's the figure who eventually becomes the rebel leader of the warriors who break off from the organization and seek its destruction. I can't say much more about it than that, since most of it is post-time skip stuff. Oh, by the way, yeah, there's a time skip in the story. But Miria is a character who realizes very early on that the organization just uses up and spits out warriors like her without a care in the world. Like Claire, she's out for revenge, but it's more than just personal for her. Her choice to turn on the organization is one she justifies as in the interests of every warrior within it, despite the fact that her choices make her their enemy as well. Unfortunately, legendary superhero Captain Obvious doesn't spell this out until 7 years after she breaks away, but it's a dilemma that she struggles with for some time, and it affects her interactions with the other warriors. Like Claire, she's willing to lose her life for this cause, often making up these ridiculously elaborate plans that have her basically doing all of the work, until she eventually learns to stop treating her fellow warriors like obstacles or children, and instead trust in them as comrades who can actually make their own choices. These are the main examples to mention, with other characters being a bit more hit and miss. When it comes to the villains, the dynamic of Dalf and Refill is quite enjoyable throughout the story, and Isley is quite a cool, if somewhat underdeveloped, villain. Helen and Deneve are fairly boring at first, but after the time skip they're given much more to do and get to be more fleshed out. Galatea is one of the few outliers to the rule of the warriors all have a meaning of life arc, as it's not really tied to a particular person, arguably anyway, but her link with the holy city of Rabona and its people post-time skip is when her character arc aligns with the story theme. Raki sucks for most of the pre-time skip stuff, but it's still important backstory for why he ends up being this glamorous Giga Chad in the post-time skip, while still feeling like it's a grown-up version of him. The rest of the characters sadly aren't quite on the same level as even these honourable mentions for me. Many of the good characters are pre-time skip, and outside of a few mentions, like Dietrich, Uma, I don't know, they're almost entirely unremarkable. Clarice is perhaps the best of the post-time skip characters, but it takes much longer for her character arc to truly flourish. Rafaela is almost interesting, but unfortunately she never gets the full development needed to be anything more than that. Still, the story makes its best characters the core of its story, for the most part, and they are its strongest asset. I've already talked at length now about the good of the series, as much as I like to praise it, but it's time to start wrapping things up and move on. So what else is good? The artwork, for one. Nora Hiroyagi is exceptionally good at drawing these beautiful, intricately detailed backgrounds and environments, often eclipsing the actual characters and their designs. The awakened beings, which, for sake of clarity, they're warriors transformed into monsters, all have these very unique and interesting designs, even if they survive for basically 2 panels and nothing more. The ones that stick with me the most are the ones where their design actually fits their character personality or profile really well, so Dalf, Reeful, Isley, and Regaldo, or Regado, whatever they end up calling him, the Silver-Eyed Lion. Besides the backgrounds and monster designs, the action is enjoyable to follow from panel to panel, whenever it isn't just people teleporting behind each other over and over. That happens a lot. Finally, the world design of Claymore. From the organization, the warriors and how they work, the awakened beings and their relationships with each other, to how the people and towns of Claymore operate, it's all quite neat. Not only that, but it's told to you in a way where this information is gradually revealed and unveils more and more about what's really happening in the story. Sadly, that's praise reserved for the pre-time skip stuff, as after that the quality of pacing definitely suffers, and there are certainly aspects of world building that are underdeveloped. Rabona is a holy city, yes, but how does its religion actually operate? Who and what does it worship? Furthermore, if the awakened beings have regions they control, what does that mean for the humans that live there? Are they simply treated as livestock, or do they have political systems based around the awakened beings there? There are certainly other questions I could ask, but they would include spoilers, and I won't get answers for them anyway. The bad. In any case, I've waxed lyrical about the good of the series for long enough. It's time to get into what I think, as a caring fan, sucks massive ass about this series. Believe me, there's a lot that I hate as well as I love about Claymore, and I won't huff the copium and say that it's flawless. Do bear in mind that, as vitriolic as I may get going forward, this is still a series that I like. Okay, gloves off then. Let's start with the dialogue, and by extension the exposition told through the dialogue. It is, to put it bluntly, incredibly clunky. One really notable moment is when Claire enters a city and passes a statue, when out of the blue a kid just starts yapping about the statue's meaning, name, and how it relates to Claire and Teresa, basically to no one in particular. It's easily the worst example I can mention, and yeah, it's pretty cringeworthy when it happens. It's an extreme of the overall problem that characters will often just spit out exposition at relevant but really unnatural moments, even, and often especially, in the middle of fight scenes. Okay, I get that it's a shonen manga. I get that for some scenes and within the limitations of the format, you have to explain things that are happening when they aren't abundantly clear visually, panel by panel. My issue comes from when this exposition is often more about clarifying the rules of their world, or important story points about characters, often extensively, while they are in the middle of a fight to the death. The Witch's Moor arc is an especially bad pre-time skip example, because it's when Claire learns about the Abyssal Ones, these are basically the big bads of the awakened beings, and the territories they control, all in laborious length during a single drawn-out battle. To be fair, it's a fight that's deliberately being prolonged by the much more powerful Reeful, but as a reader it's such a monumentally dull and immersion-breaking way to introduce this information. Funnily enough, this happened shortly after the previously mentioned fountain incident, so why couldn't this information been given to Claire by a local when she visits the town? Like I said before, if these people are living under a constant threat of a ruling Abyssal One, why wouldn't they at least warn a traveller of the risks they're facing? It gets the same information across, but in a more believable way for the story's world. This is by no means the only example, but these cases help to demonstrate why this particular habit is an issue. That's it for exposition, but I'm not done harping about the dialogue yet. You know, all that stuff I was saying about the characters and the meaning of their developments? That wasn't just me reading too much into things. At least half of that stuff is just flat out told to you at points in the story. I don't know what Norihiroyagi thinks of his audience, but he has the terrible habit of needing to tell rather than show. It's not at every point, and like I've said before, I think the main characters he's made are still good, but there's such a bluntness to the dialogue as a whole that it just stops sounding like natural speech. Like the awkward exposition, it takes me out of the experience as a reader if characters don't talk like human beings. That's a harder line to draw than you might think, but I'd say in this case it sometimes gets in the way of actually characterizing the warriors. Helen certainly doesn't have this problem, as she's consistently an outspoken blabbermouth from start to finish, but for Deneve it's particularly bad. She's supposed to be the more reserved but still bullish figure that handles the other warriors with tough love and harsh truths, but her dialogue and portrayal are so wooden that often she feels neither bullish nor caring at all. She does get better post-time skip, however, as her closer interactions with established characters allow her to more naturally express her personality, but it still takes a while for that to show. Alright, now for the big one. This one I'd argue factors into many of the problems specifically within the post-time skip stuff, but you can definitely argue for it in the pre-time skip stuff as well. Okay, so the series has a power creep issue. Wow, really? A shonen anime has power creep in it? Do things get absurdly crazy with increasingly powerful foes and abilities pulled from an ass? How is truly astounding and unheard of. I know, but in Claymore it's worth particular mention because of how it interferes with the storytelling and pacing. It's normal for threats to get progressively more difficult as the story develops, as well as the main characters themselves, but it still has to make some sense in universe. It hits Priscilla quite heavily too, as she's supposed to be the biggest threat of the series, and she definitely is, but she also has to compete with the other, newer enemy concepts and power levels. For instance, one of the later threats post-time skip is a large, combined awakened being, towering over everything on the horizon and firing out various parasitizing mooks. This thing is hyped up to be something on the level of power of Priscilla, an otherwise generic-looking, unicorn-horn, bat-wing-touting basic bitch. So, how does their fight actually fare? Priscilla takes a shed load of hits and doesn't give a fuck. The parasitizing effect of the missiles and mooks doesn't matter. She kicks and beats the fuck out of anything even in a human form, looking like a bored child all the way. This drags on for an agonizingly long and boring time, until she gets absorbed by this entity and put in the fridge. One of the most hyped up fights and moments for the midpoint of the story turns into one of the dullest and worst arcs in the story, purely because the power levels absolutely trivialize all the bullshit that's on the panels. You have the newer awakened beings and enemies doing all this crazy stuff, and in order to compete with that, they just have Priscilla just straight up not give a fuck about what they do. What makes it even more of a piss take is that there isn't an in-universe reason for Priscilla's absurd power. Her levels of regeneration are completely absurd. Yeah, you heard me. Basically, no amount of damage she takes actually matters, until the end of the story, of course, so none of the fights she's in have any real impact whatsoever. I'm oversimplifying, as I'm sure certain fans will probably remind me, but really not by much. Actually, let's talk about Priscilla's character some more, since I haven't done that yet. Don't worry, it's not because I forgot to include her in the good section, it's because she doesn't belong there. On paper, her character suits the themes of the story quite well. Unlike the other characters who eventually find meaning in their lives and things to love and appreciate about life, Priscilla spends her whole life hating and destroying all the life around her, ultimately turning that hatred onto herself. There is a window into what could have been with her interactions with Isley and Raki, but it's more impactful for those two characters than it is for Priscilla's character. As a villain, having her own developments contrast and oppose those of the protagonists, acting like a dark reflection of what they could become if they fail, is generally a good idea. The problem, though, is that most of what I've just said is revealed only at the very end of the story, with barely any foreshadowing of this development before it's all over. By that point, it's already too late to care. And before you get on my case about, oh, what about this, or what about that, when it comes to foreshadowing in the early stuff, ultimately, barely any of it actually matters in terms of understanding Priscilla's character in the moment or how that character develops over time. It's only really revealed at the end how it's actually relevant, and before that it basically doesn't matter and doesn't make her any more interesting. The funny thing about it is that, on a much smaller scale, this dynamic was already done, and significantly better, with Ophelia. Ophelia is a single-minded, selfish and psychotic warrior who happily cuts down anyone in the way of her violent antics, eventually turning on Claire when they first meet. Like Claire, she also has a quest for vengeance against Priscilla, but without any friendships or moral code to restrain her violence and power, she becomes just as dangerous to people as the awakened beings themselves. This eventually does cause her to awaken, and once she realizes this, it disgusts her that she's undeniably turned into a monster, though in reality that happened a long time ago, and she allows herself to be killed by Claire. Like with Priscilla, she is a selfish, powerful figure led by her hatred, with no appreciation of life, eventually turning that hatred on herself. This is all done in one single story arc, technically two, and yet it handles its villains' character development significantly better than that of the main villains for the entire series, even though they are effectively the same. Since I'm talking about villains, I don't think it's much of a spoiler at this point to say that the organization is less than good-natured and wholesome. As the basis for many of the main characters' purpose, suffering, and conflicts, the organization serves a very important purpose in the story. For all of the warriors, the organization is what their whole lives are based around, as they direct them to unquestioningly follow orders to kill and die as they see fit. Of course, this doesn't always work out, and Teresa is just one of the most high-profile examples of warriors turning against the organization's abuses of power over their lives. As more and more of the main characters break away to follow their own paths, the organization goes from an ever-present obstacle to being one of the main villains of the story, especially as the characters start to realize the truth of its role in their world. So why am I only now talking about them like this? Well, because much of what I originally liked about the organization was ruined by the power creep at a post-time skip. I'll give you an example. Before the time skip, there's this huge battle in the north where basically all of the warriors fall and fail to stop the advancing army of awakened beings. They buy just enough time for the organization's secret weapon, Alicia and Beth, twins who can safely awaken, to completely demolish whatever's left of that army once it reaches them. For the next 7 years, these two are the pinnacle of the organization's strength. That is, until they both die fighting Priscilla. So Miria thinks to herself, great, while everybody's fighting off in the west, the organization's completely exposed. I can take them on without any trouble. Of course, when she does this, it turns out they actually had another pair of twins that could safely awaken each other as they fight, presumably kept in the fridge in case of emergency. There is virtually zero foreshadowing that they existed in the first place, and they're accompanied by a frankly better alternative. And the fact that they're just a carbon copy of Alicia and Beth, right after they've just died, is what makes this so much of an ass-pull. It's not the only one, but it's certainly the most egregious. The other example, lesser by only a small margin, is when they revive dead warriors with the flesh of Priscilla. The justification is that they've just been hoarding these bodies for the hell of it, when their resident mad scientist says, hey, I've found this flesh that can do crazy things to people. How about I stick it in these dead bodies? And the organization, currently under attack from rebel warriors, says, fuck it, why not? Can't be any worse than it already is. Insanity then ensues, with the revived warriors soon transforming into monsters and causing yet another mess for Miria and the others to clean up. You might have noticed by this point that many of my criticisms are reserved for the post-time skip storylines. Truthfully, before I started writing this script, I had much fonder memories of the post-time skip stuff. But once I refamiliarized myself with it, I realized just how sloppy it is compared to what came before. It does just feel like Norihiro Yagi was unsure of what to do to get to the ending of the story, or how long it should take, so he decided to just stall it out with various different forms of unnecessary bullshit. Part of this has to do with the monthly deadlines of a serialized manga, but the drop in quality is significant. The whole point of a time skip is that you get to skip through the stuff in the story where nothing is happening, getting right to the important events. To then reach that point and fill it with bloated, half-baked nonsense just shows how little thought was put into how the story develops once the time skip is done. But hey, at least they didn't spend forever on a boat voyage, right? The ugly! Alright, this is where I get to take my ranting cap off for a little bit, because this section isn't just bad 2.0. I reserved it for things that either haven't aged well or almost work, but are let down by a few things. This is what I've been saving the anime discussion for, since it fits right into that latter category. I think the 2007 anime still holds up quite well. It has some great music, the animation, while stiff at times, is generally faithful to the panels of the manga, the art quality is generally an enhanced version of Yagi's work, and it follows the pre-time skip story quite faithfully. Until, of course, the moment it doesn't, and that's the moment it overtakes the manga. You might have already heard about the ending, or how it's bad, but I'll give a summary here. Out of the blue, Priscilla shows up at the end, and Claire chases her down. Claire is almost awakened, and fights Priscilla in this form, actually managing to defeat her. But as she's about to kill Priscilla, Raki steps in, spouts some bullshit that makes her stop, and Jean sacrifices herself to bring Claire back from the brink, which is the only actually accurate thing about the ending. Isley then just does a goofy cameo appearance to yoink Priscilla away, and then they all go off into the sunset to live their lives. Yeah, It's fucking lame. It's not the only problem the anime has, since I do think the animation is often needlessly stiff, and it perhaps follows the manga's pacing and dialogue a little too closely for my liking. Like I've said already, there are issues with the pacing and dialogue in the series as the manga, and the anime being so faithful to the manga just means it retains the same problems. In a way, that's fine, because I'd prefer it to the opposite problem of the anime just disregarding the manga storyline entirely, but there's a fine balance to strike. It's tempting to think of adaptations as an extreme between the 100% faithful depiction of the source material, or the producer's dumb idea about how to do things differently that just shits all over the source material, to make something laughably awful and insulting. There's no shortage of the latter, unfortunately. Here's the thing, though. No adaptation is truly 100% faithful, because by adapting it to a new medium, you change the way the story is told. From manga to anime, you add a soundtrack, animation, and voices that weren't available in the original story, and that affects the impression given by certain scenes or characters. Otherwise, small changes are made either to address production issues or simply to clean up something that doesn't work well or hasn't aged well. For instance, the Lord of the Rings trilogy is generally considered to be a fantastic adaptation of the original stories, unless somehow that's changed recently, but whatever. But it completely removes one of the characters in the original books, which is Tom Bombadil. It's fine though, because Tom doesn't really do a lot in the story anyway. He's more of a convenient plot device and, frankly, a joke character. Then there's High Fidelity, which changes the location of the story in the film from the UK to the US. And despite a few cultural nods being different, the story still remains faithful to the intended arcs of its characters and its style. Attack on Titan, God forbid I praise that at all, but makes very few changes in its adaptation. One of the changes it does do is hint at the world beyond the walls much earlier than the original manga does, and as strange as this may seem, it does actually suit the moment fairly well, because it's during a scene where most of the characters are from beyond the walls. Where I'm going with this is that an adaptation doesn't have to follow the source material word by word, panel by panel, to be both a good and faithful adaptation. I'm about to wrap up soon, I promise, but there's one last thing I wanted to get off my chest, and it's retrospective. If Claymore were to get a reboot, such as what's happened with Fruits Basket and Spice and Wolf recently, what would I want? Obviously, it would follow the manga story from start to finish, now that it's all done. Yet, I've just spent this whole time pointing out its flaws and shortcomings, so I wouldn't want it to be a carbon copy either. Try to imagine 5 or 6 episodes of just Priscilla stomping everything with no effort in a post-timeskip era, and how boring that would be to watch. Oh, no, maybe that's just me. Similarly, do I think all of the dialogue needs to be copied verbatim, when most of it is just iterating things that should be obvious when they're animated? There are definitely things I want changed, but they shouldn't be key story or character moments. As a fan, I don't have too many gripes with the actual story, more with how it gets told. It can certainly be told in a better way, but the story should remain the same. After all, it's the reason why I like the series so much. This is all academic, of course, because I don't think this series is getting a reboot anytime soon. Prove me wrong, I'd love to be. It's just not popular enough despite its cult status. It's a series I like, but it's difficult to recommend it to people for the reasons I've just been explaining in this video, so getting a retelling of the story might actually help with that. I'm not holding my breath, though. For now, it's just a series that I like, that I've wanted to talk about for a long time now. I keep coming back to Claymore from time to time, and it's rare for a story to have that effect on me. It's even rarer for a series of which I have much to criticise. That's it for now, anyway, so thanks for listening to my ramblings, assuming you didn't just skip through most of them, and I'll end it here. I'm not sure what I'll do next with this channel, since I basically just do this for fun, when it's fun, but I've got some ideas, so stay tuned for more news, and hopefully I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. As it's not really tied to a particular person, arguably anyway, but her link in the holy with... Oh!